And so welcome everyone. We got a good group of people here, especially our online people. Now, I am a bit of a people person, so I'm certainly not going to require it for those of you who are here for extra credit incentive. But if you're able to, I'd love you to undo your video mute and show us faces. So if you're able to do that, it's not a requirement. But it just makes us feel like we're really in a community of people if we can see more faces out there. So I'd really appreciate it if you guys are able to bring your videos to life. That'd be great. We're going to do some giveaways as we work through the question and answer session. We're going to wrap up. We're going to try to be timely here, right at about a half hour, so we won't be too long, and we'll work through the questions. Jim could probably talk for 3 or 4 hours on this, so we'll see how many questions we get to. We have your questions that you presented ahead of time, but as we're speaking, if you guys have some additional questions or maybe follow-up questions to something that's asked, we'll be monitoring the chat box, and we'll just decide whether we can try to fit additional questions in. So please feel free to do that if you feel so inclined. We'll be doing some giveaways. So I'm holding up here the Gwartney Institute t-shirt, and we have our PPE advertised on the back, along with Poverty Sucks, because we're kind of anti-poverty with the Gwartney Institute. And then we have these nice little pens. So we're going to randomly draw names throughout the 30 minutes. And our graduate assistant, Nate Johnson, is on, and he will private message you if you're one of the lucky winners, so that we can get your mailing address and we'll ship this stuff out to you. So that's part of our plan for tonight's fun. So you've already heard the introductions with Jim, and so I think we're going to jump right into the questions. So Jim, question number 1, what would a country have to do to improve its economic freedom rating?
Well, I guess there would be some things it would need to do and others it would need to refrain from doing. Important among the things that it would need to do is to keep taxes relatively low, particularly marginal tax rates. And in the legal area, to maintain a legal system that results in the even-handed enforcement of contracts and protection of property rights. That's certainly very, very important. And there's several dimensions to that within the index, but basically that's the key element. And to provide access to sound money, that is to say money that maintains its value across time, would be very important things for a country to do to improve the rating. In terms of refraining, it would need to refrain from various kinds of regulations, for example, regulations in the trade area that restrict international trade. And in the domestic area, refraining from doing things like imposing price controls and establishment of essentially state ownership of enterprises, refraining from that, and refraining from regulations that interfere with trade and the operation of businesses. So those would be the major things. That economic freedom is about reliance upon personal choice and voluntary exchange and openness to compete in markets and protection of people and their property from aggressors. So essentially it needs to do things that would be consistent with those and refrain from doing things that would be inconsistent with those propositions.
Okay, great. We have our first winner is Amy Matthews. So Amy, Nate will be private chatting you here to get your mailing information. And up next, Justin has a question for Dr. Gwartney.
Dr. Gwartney, that was a very informative answer to what countries can do to increase their score on economic freedom. I was wondering what impact you think the pandemic has had on economic freedom so far?
Oh, wow. And I guess I'll focus mostly on the United States. First of all, the data in the latest Economic Freedom of the World report, which was published earlier in 2020, is for data of 2018. So it's actually going to be a while before we're going to have the data where the impact of the pandemic will show up. But we certainly know some things that will be reduce economic freedom in terms of the pandemic, that the regulations restricting business activity, the actions that sort of closed down businesses, the policies that have resulted in very large increases in government expenditures are going to increase government expenditures relative to government consumption, for example, and government transfer payments relative to the private sector. There actually have been, well, let me just also say that I think one of the things that's come out of the pandemic and was to a degree already started prior to the pandemic, but increased popularity and imposition of trade restrictions. And that's going to reduce the economic freedom of the United States. And most of that increase in government expenditures is financed by borrowing. And one of the components of the index is sort of magnitude of government borrowing relative to private borrowing. And as that government borrowing is going up so much, that's going to reduce economic freedom. There have been some regulations coming out of the pandemic that have actually deregulations that have expanded economic freedom. For example, the relaxation of regulations against telemarketing, and that repeal in some cases of the certificate of need legislation. That's basically legislation where you have to get permission from your competitors before you can enter in and compete. And in the healthcare area, a lot of regulations were, a number of regulations were reduced that prohibited healthcare workers from working across state lines. In a number of states, when they needed additional healthcare workers, they at least relaxed those regulations. And in some cases, hopefully they will end up not reinstating them. So that I would expect that the economic freedom rating of the United States for the year 2020 is going to be a good bit lower. And a good bit here might be 0.5%, 0.5 point, say, rather than being around 8, it may drop to 7.5 or even a little bit lower than that. And my expectation would be that a lot of other countries, that will also be the case.
Thank you, Jim.
I got it.
Okay, we had some feedback there, but we got it taken care of. First off, I'd like to say our second winner for a shirt is Amar Kumar. So Nate will be messaging you privately. Jim, I had a question from a student here that was regarding natural resources. And so the student asks, how do natural resources and then, for example, access to safe and reliable drinking water play into the Economic Freedom Index?
Yeah, actually, natural resources are not directly integrated into the index at all. I think it might be almost more useful to think about the relationship going the other way. The countries that have more economic freedom are likely to have cleaner environments, more sanitary water conditions, and things of that sort related to their greater prosperity. I would also note that countries that have relatively few natural resources, some of them do very well in terms of their economic freedom. I guess the clearest case of that would be Hong Kong, which other than its port really does not have any natural resources. Japan is also a country with relatively few natural resources, which does very well in the index. So remember, the index is a measure of the degree that people have economic freedom. It's not a measure of wealth. It's not a measure of income. And the purpose of putting it together was really to turn this issue of why it is that some countries grow and prosper into a scientific question. I guess almost since the time of Adam Smith, that economists have been inclined, at least a sizable share of the economics profession, to argue that freer economies perform at a higher level than those that are less free, that are government planned. Well, is this really true? Well, if you don't have a measure of economic freedom or the extent that countries are relying upon markets relative to political planning, you really are not in a position to address that issue scientifically. So that not only my perception, but those involved in the measurement of economic freedom from the very beginning, that we perceived that we were developing a scientific instrument that would allow us to test things about the importance of of resources and to look to see how it is that economic freedom would impact a number of different dimensions that are important from the standpoint of the quality of our life, including important resources like sanitation and access to clean water.
Okay, great. All right, so our next winner is Jennifer Davidson. So Nate will be reaching out to you, Jennifer. Congratulations. Jim, our next question was any of the information you gathered from other countries shocking to you?
Well, shocking is a pretty strong word, but there were certainly a number of things that I was surprised about. And you kind of get, do you learn anything from this yourself? One of the things that I certainly have been surprised about is how onerous it is to operate a business, to engage in business activity legally in many countries. That if, just to operate a simple kind of retail business, for example, in many countries, you've got to get permissions from multiple authorities. And oftentimes getting that permission will take months in order to get, and sometimes involve fees, but more likely to be time consuming kinds of situations. And particularly the countries like Venezuela, Haiti, some of the really poor countries. And Venezuela was not always a poor country, but it has a low degree of economic freedom that a lot of business activity it's really time consuming to operate it legally. The other thing I would say I was most surprised about is I had kind of bought into, and I'm talking about a couple of decades ago myself, about the idea that Scandinavian countries are, big government and government dominated types of countries. And interestingly enough, when you look in the regulatory area, and particularly business regulatory area, in general, countries like Sweden and Denmark and Norway and Finland are generally more business friendly, and business friendly in the sense of you being able to operate a business, open a business, and comply with the legal regulations with a minimal amount of resources having to be allocated to that. That they in general are more open to business activities, the Scandinavian countries are, than certainly the Southern European countries, but even more so than the United States and the United Kingdom. So I guess, there's an inclination to think of those countries as being big government dominated economies, that's only part of the story, that they're very open to trade and they're very open to business types of activities with minimal regulations. So very much Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland, they're among the more free. All those countries are in the top 30 among the 162 countries in terms of the economic freedom of the world. So they very much have market institutions.
Dr. Gwartney, we have a question from a student here about the proposal to raise the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about maybe what you see the economic impacts of that change being, in terms of overall income, equality, et cetera.
Well, first of all, minimum wage is a type of price control. It's a price floor. It's a setting a minimum which for the exchange to take place, it has to be at that floor or above. In terms of the impact the minimum wage has on equality, I think there's a lot of economic illiteracy surrounding the minimum wage. A lot of people think of it as kind of a free lunch. Hey, wouldn't it be better if people were paid $15 an hour rather than $10 an hour or $7 an hour? And of course, if that's what you think it is, that there's no basically cost of it. But that's not true. It generates many secondary effects. And I think the most important secondary effect as it relates to economic freedom is it essentially says, if your productivity, if you're have low productivity and your productivity is not such that you can earn $15 an hour, then we're going to prohibit you from working. That really strikes me as something very basic, striking at the heart of economic freedom. And so while some of, if you think of it in terms of impact on income, there may be some low income people who are going to be able to obtain somewhat higher wages than otherwise would be the case. But there's also some low income people who are going to be prohibited from working. And so in that sense, the most disadvantaged people in our society are actually going to be harmed by it. In addition, that I think there's a tendency of both the proponents of the minimum wage as well as the opponents of minimum wage to fail to recognize that it's only one dimension of the employment exchange transaction. There's a lot of other margins that will be adjusted, such as working conditions, working hours, auxiliary benefits, and those things will be adjusted. And as a result, the sort of, as well as things like location of the work. And as a result, those even who are able to obtain jobs at $15 an hour are not going to be helped nearly as much as what it looks like they would be. Their schedule's likely to be less favorable. Their opportunities for training less favorable. Their location in terms of convenience to where they live less favorable. And a number of people who, even you end up working at $15 an hour, are actually would be prefer to be working at $12 an hour in a more convenient location, doing something that they found more enjoyable. So those other marginal effects mean that the wages don't go up as much as it looks like they would be, and therefore, to some degree, that may muffle the negative impact of reductions in employment, which demand curves slope downward, including the demand curve for unskilled labor. So we would expect that there would be some lower level of employment, but perhaps less so than the monetary increases in wages might appear, because these other marginal elements related to the job will also be impacted. But certainly as it relates to economic freedom, there's it's a no-brainer that essentially you're substituting the political process in terms of determination of wages for the market exchange process. So it definitely reduces economic freedom.
Thank you, Dr. Gwartney. We have the next shirt winner, who is Chris Shaner. So Nate's going to message you. And Dr. Gwartney, I have a question that actually several students asked about cryptocurrencies. It's kind of a hot topic nowadays.
Right.
And so kind of the common theme of the questions was, can cryptocurrencies empower economic freedom, or how do cryptocurrencies relate to economic freedom?
Well, as I mentioned, that access to money of sound value is an important element of economic freedom. And why that's true is because money is basically one side of most every exchange that we make. And a lot of exchanges involve time dimensions, borrowing and lending of money, various kinds of investment kinds of things, that time is important in terms of that exchange process, which makes it important that you have money that maintains its value. Now, with regard to essentially cryptocurrencies, the advantage of things like Bitcoin is essentially that it would have potentially a currency that would have a limitation upon the quantity that would be available, of the numeric values, if you like, of the currency. So there's a limitation on supply that, if they become widely used, and they could well have more stable value. Now, as the reason why there's a lot of interest in it right now is because the money has been up and down, and is currently up pretty quite substantially, and that relates to the fact that it's something new. And so, in terms of the potential, it definitely could be and should be, from the standpoint of maximizing economic freedom, an option for people to use those currencies those digital currencies in terms of the exchange process. Now, it currently does not enter into the index in any way, but it's something that I think we will need to think about considerably in the years immediately ahead. And if it becomes an option to be used on a pretty widespread basis, and in some countries, Venezuela being one because of various kinds of restrictions, well, hyperinflation in Venezuela, and other restrictions upon transferring of dollars, for example, into and out of Venezuela, that the digital currencies have, such as Bitcoin, are becoming more widely used there. So if countries put restrictions on the use of those currencies, certainly it would be a restriction upon economic freedom. Now, the reason why, I mean, at the time that we sort of, up until now, I guess we would say, that basically currencies have been issued by governments. And so to think about a private currency alternative, we did not integrate into the index. The index, by the way, does include a variable for whether or not people are free to use alternative currencies to the domestic currency of their country. And there's about half, maybe even more than half of the countries around the world now allow their citizens to maintain bank accounts, both domestically as well as abroad, in alternative currencies. And that essentially makes it easier for people to have access to a currency that maintains its purchasing power. But I think that the digital currency is one of the most exciting things that's currently going on, and it has the potential to expand the economic freedom of people.
Call, Joe Connors.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So La Joanna Williams, you are our next winner. Congratulations, Nate.
Well, Rush, you have a lot of winners. I think that's how you're getting the students to come. Maybe not. Thank you.
Okay, so I have your next question here, Jim, where we have some speaker thing going back and forth, but this one's kind of a chicken and egg concept. So be ready here. Are people who believe they have greater control over their lives likely to demand institutions consistent with the principle of economic freedom? Or are people who live in countries with higher levels of economic freedom more likely to perceive higher levels of control over their lives?
Well, the answer, there has been some research on the last question, whether people living in countries that have higher degree of economic freedom perceive that they have more control over their lives. And the answer to that question is yes, that we do find. There is the data by a European survey that asks a number of questions related to control over your lives and various types of things that the survey has been going on back to the 1980s. And so a number of scholars have used that data to address that particular question. Now, the question about whether or not if you have more control over your life that you're likely to or countries where people have more control over their life are likely to have more economic freedom, I'm unaware of any study on that particular topic. There has also been a good bit of studies related control over your life as well as economic freedom with life satisfaction, or what is sometimes referred to as happiness. It's basically a question where people are subjectively on a 0 to 10 scale asked to indicate how satisfied they are with their current state of life, where 1 would mean unsatisfied and 10 would be quite highly satisfied. And you do find a pretty strong and highly significant relationship between people who have perceived that they have a great deal of control over their lives and how satisfied that they are with their lives. And that's not too surprising. I mean, at the normative level, that essentially economic freedom and maybe personal freedom more generally provides people with a greater opportunity to mold and shape their lives in terms of what they would like it to be, to stress the things and the trade-offs that are most important to them as individuals. So we would expect that people who have more economic freedom would allow people to have more control over their lives, and that unsurprisingly is related to personal life satisfaction. But this is an area where I think the tools are there, the data are there to do a good bit of additional fruitful research in this area. So maybe some of our people who are, finishing degrees and things of that sort, this would be a good research topic, good area for research.
Dr. Gwartney, we have a question concerning the relationship between economic freedom and religion. So has there been any linkages found between degrees of economic freedom and the influence of religion in different countries or regions?
Well, there have been some studies that look at different types of religions, particularly, I guess, Christianity, Protestantism, Catholicism, and Islam. And they do not show a real strong relationship between any of those sort of religious views and economic freedom. And that we do find countries that are, I mean, for example, Japan, I'd mentioned, is a country that has a pretty high degree of economic freedom, but would be thought of as largely a secular type of country. At least Christianity would clearly be less important in Japan. And that we also find cases, well, let me just say one thing about the relationship between religion and maybe through economic freedom to life satisfaction, that there have been some studies about the impact of strong religious beliefs, both in terms of stating about how important God is in your life, as well as evidenced by say things like regular church attendance. And so you might think of it as, say, a person with very strong religious beliefs. And you do find that across various kinds of religions, that people who religion is very important in their life indicate that they feel that they have more control over their life and a higher degree of life satisfaction. But just in terms of looking at a specific religion, like say Christianity and economic freedom, of course, there was a very famous book about, the Protestant ethic that was the author argued that about 100 years ago, that Protestantism was very important to economic prosperity. Well, using the economic freedom of the world data, that people have not been able to find that link in recent decades. I think, again, that's an area where, is important from the standpoint of economic research. The Fraser Institute, which is the sort of premier institute, or I guess you'd say central institute in terms of the economic freedom data, they're also involved with two other institutes, including the Cato Institute in the United States, in developing a human freedom index. And religion is a component of that particular index. So religious freedom is certainly an integral part of a wider concept of freedom that we might think of human freedom. So those who are interested in sort of the linkage between religion and human freedom, you might want to take a look at just Google the Human Freedom Project, and you'll identify it with either the Fraser Institute or the Cato Institute. Good question.
Okay, well, just like that, 30 minutes has elapsed. So we're going to allow just another minute or two to get our survey link out to you. Since we closed on religion, I wanted to announce to the class that Peter, Justin, and I do a faith and economics podcast that we talk about economic concepts and kind of the overlap of faith and economics. We've been doing that for about over 2 years, I think now. And we've had over 7,000 followers on that. So it's kind of a fun thing. And we put it out every Monday. So you can, if you listen to one and not another or whatever. So that might be a fun thing for you guys to check out if you want some more information there. So Jim, thank you very much. It's been very informative. Of course, I always love talking to you. You've impressed me since my very first time I ever met you, and I'm running PowerPoints for a blind man, and he's got all the data right off the top of his head. And it was just amazing, and it always continues to be amazing. And I'm very blessed to have a relationship with you.
Well, I was blessed to get a wonderful education at Ottawa University, including studying under Sherwin Snyder and Wayne Angel. But students who are currently there, you have the opportunity to study under some great scholars and take advantage of it. Ottawa will always have a special place in my heart, and I truly appreciate the education that I was received there, and delighted to continue to have involvement with it.
All right, well, great. Well, we have one last winner for tonight, Suresh Konatan. So you are our last winner. So Nate will reach out to you here in the chat box. And all you other students, we have an exit survey, and that's how you'll get recorded for extra credit and other things. So Peter is putting that out on the chat box. If you have any troubles picking that up or something, you can feel free to email one of us, but otherwise it should be all there in the chat box. And we have a few questions for you to answer as you exit out of this. And we sure appreciate you all listening. I know you've been charmed by Jim, like everybody is. He is quite a scholar and a gentleman, and I'm proud to be associated with him and continue on the legacy of great economic education here at Ottawa University through the Gwartney Institute. So we'll let you guys continue getting your surveys in, and thank you very much. Have a nice night.